Hello there, this is Dominic Carroll from Hargreaves Lansdown. Thank you for signing up to the Supercharging Your Pensions webinar. The webinar itself will take around about 20 minutes or so. If you do have any questions at all, do feel free to contact us. I'll be putting up quite a few telephone numbers, email addresses for a few different avenues where you can get information relevant to your pensions. So do feel free to contact us in regards to this or anything else pension related. What I need to let you know is that the webinar itself is actually information as opposed to financial advice. So what that means is I can give you details on kind of how you might look at building up your pension, but I couldn't tell you what the best thing to do in your circumstances would be. So in terms of what we'll cover today, firstly, we'll aim to briefly cover how pensions generally work so that everyone is on the same page before we move on to the next step, which is where we'll look at what you might need in retirement and how you can project based on what you're currently doing, where you might get to based on a few assumptions. The third thing we'll look at is how you build an action plan. So if you've built a projection and actually you're some way away from where you would like to be in retirement, what are the key things or the key factors that you can amend to make sure that you're on track? Now, in regards to how much you might need in retirement, one key factor that has had implications is how long people tend to live. And as you can see here, we've got some statistics which show you that people tend to live a lot longer than they did historically. So for a male born in 1981, there was a 6% chance of living beyond their 100th birthday. For females, slightly higher at 9%. Now, for someone born in 2018, for a male that is, it will be 14% chance of living to 100 or beyond. And for females, again, higher at 18%. So essentially 1 in 5 females or just under reaching 100 or above. It's anticipated in the same report from the Office for National Statistics that in 25 years' time, by 2043, there'll be 20 or just under 21% of newborn boys and actually 26% of newborn girls expected to live beyond age 100. So yeah, there's a few changes that have taken place, which means that actually, if you're building up a pension pot, it might need to last a lot longer than you'd had in mind. This tends to have quite a big impact. People do tend to underestimate how long they might be retired for. It also impacts kind of retirement ages. So if I was to ask anybody listening into the webinar, what is your ideal retirement age? A lot of people tend to say, well, maybe 65, maybe a bit later. Probably not in most cases. Most common answer we get is tomorrow, to be honest. So it can vary quite a lot. But it's worth bearing in mind if you are retiring at 65, as we saw with life expectancy, you could be relying on a pension pot for 30 more years. So it's really important that we use this time while you're working or before retirement to ensure that you've built up a pot that's adequate enough to last that long. So how do you go about building up a pension pot? There's the 2 key factors that make a really big difference when you're looking at building up your pension. The first factor is your contributions. And of course, the more you put in, the more you would expect to get out when you come to retirement. Contributions are helped in a number of different ways. Firstly, anything that you put into your pension based on a few kind of allowances and so on are entitled to tax relief. So you can make contributions and actually receive cash back on top from the government. And really, that's the government's way of encouraging people to save into a pension to ensure that that individuals within the UK have enough at retirement. Another thing that's happened is auto-enrollment, which means that if you have a workplace pension scheme, it's very likely that you've been contacted over the years and kind of pushed into a pension scheme. And when we say that, years ago, if you wanted to be part of a pension scheme at your workplace, you'd have to contact your HR team or whoever's responsible for pensions and kind of push things forward yourself and try and kind of get a pension set up and ask essentially to be part of that. But auto-enrollment flips things on its head, which means that when you're enrolled, when you join a company, you're automatically put into a pension scheme if you meet a few different criteria, unless you choose to actively opt out and not be a part of that scheme. And really, that has meant that quite a lot more people are now contributing to a pension than we have been seeing historically. So ultimately, the more people contributing, the more you contribute to your pension, the more you might get out at the end. But it's not all about how much you put in, because the issue there is that you could just put in kind of very sizable contributions into your pension. But if it's not growing over time, there is a real risk that inflation can erode the value of that pot, because over time, things that we buy on a daily basis can become more expensive, as we have seen due to inflation. If your investments or your pensions aren't growing over time, then they're losing their purchasing power. And that's where the second element, which is investments, comes in. That's probably the area where most people tend to bury their head in the sand. It's understandable that if you're not involved with investments day to day or familiar with investing, it's quite easy to kind of shy away from that. But actually with pensions, more so now than ever, there's quite a large range of investment options out there, whether you're investing in kind of individual companies, individual shares, buying bonds, or investing through a fund, as the vast majority of people tend to. There's a lot of flexibility and a lot of control for you to make sure that you're getting a good level of growth and also the level of security that you would like. So these two elements combined decide how big the pension would be when you get to retirement, and ultimately that's the end goal. You want the largest pot that you can have when you're ready to step back from work. As it stands, you can currently access up to 25% of your pensions completely tax-free from age 55. You'd have to decide what you're doing with the remaining 75% at that point, but there's quite a few options available to you. If you do want more information on your retirement options, there are webinars that we've been running, focusing across this week on a number of different kind of subjects, one of which is your options of retirement and how you can access tax-free cash. You can also find out more through the Hargreaves Lansdown website through the retirement section. Worth noting that the retirement age for personal pensions and workplace pensions is increasing from 55 to 57 in 2028. But this is 10 years behind the state pension, which is currently 65, moving to 67 in 2028. So hopefully that gives you an idea about how pensions tend to work. I mean, this is in regards to what we call defined contribution pension schemes. If you have a pension scheme which is termed as defined benefit or final salary, they may work slightly differently, and you might want to speak to your pension provider to understand more about how you can get more out of that scheme and what the details are with that. So now we understand how pensions tend to work. What is our target? What is it that we need for retirement to ensure an adequate level of living? We've taken these statistics here from the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association, who carry out reports and so on what people might need in retirement based on a certain standard of living. So what they've done, they've put together 3 different profiles based on a minimum, moderate, and comfortable retirement. What you can see here is that for an individual, for a minimum level of retirement, which would simply be kind of paying their bills and no kind of frills attached to that in retirement, it's a requirement of about 10,200 as a rough estimate. Now, the state pension, if you have your full national insurance record of 35 years of contributions, might entitle you to around £9,100, roughly speaking. You can check that online at gov.uk/check your pension. Now, that will get you some of the way there, but there is still the need to have a workplace or some other kind of pension in place to get you to that 10,000 or so. If you're a couple, the minimum retirement kind of needs that were found in this report was about 16,000. So actually, in that scenario, if you're both getting the full state pension, that may well be enough. If we scoot straight along to the comfortable retirement, now what they meant by this is, in the report, it explains that it's someone who is maybe having kind of 2-3 week holidays per year, someone who is replacing their car every 3 years, new car every 3 years, those kind of things. So a really very comfortable standard of living. For an individual, you would need about £33,000 to live that standard. So there you can see the state pension is making up a lot less of your requirements there. Between a couple, it's about 47,000. But if you're a couple with a full state pension, you're looking at about £18,000 of that already covered by the state. It's the rest that you're looking to fill with your workplace or your personal pensions. These are kind of very personal figures, so you might have a different idea about what you need in retirement, whether it's more or less. Worthwhile doing a bit of research around that, because when you do come to retirement, quite often you've paid off a mortgage, so actually your costs are reduced. If you have any children, You'd hope by that point they're financially independent, though that's not always the case. You're also not commuting or often not kind of required to save into a pension once you're retired. So you might make savings elsewhere. That being said, you might spend a lot more time on leisure, holidays, and so on. So it's about balancing those changes and understanding what you might need. And that's really important because that will give you the target to aim for. So coming on to your action plan, once you've kind of carried out research and understand a bit more about what you might need in retirement, it's then looking at how you get to that figure and kind of how you project to make sure that that's the case. So for the action plan, we'll have a look at how you track that, and then we'll look at how you review your investments, but also how you kind of simplify things as well. And then we'll briefly talk about contributions in more details also. So one tool that we've made available through our website, through the address that you can see in red along the top there, is the pensions calculator. So the way that this works is you input your details, such as date of birth, your salary as it stands at the moment, your existing pension provisions that you have, whether that's with Hargreaves Lansdown or anywhere else. You can account for everything here, and your ideal retirement age. So we've put 65 here, though you can change that if you do want to retire before the state pension. Based on how much you're putting in, either as a monetary figure or if it's a percentage of your salary, there's the ability to put that in as well. And if your employer is making contributions, then you can kind of factor that in as well. And that will build a projection based on the kind of salary staying the same, based on the contribution staying at the same rate, and also on an assumed rate of growth, which you can actually amend depending on where you're investing. But in this example, you can see it builds a bit of a picture that you can see under number 2, which is your results. So for this individual, the estimated value of their pension pot by the time they come to retire at 65, as they'd estimated, would be worth about £254,000 in today's figures. So that's accounting for inflation at an assumed rate. They can take 25% of that tax-free, which we mentioned previously, which could be up to about £63,500. Though you can see it's a slider, so you don't necessarily have to take the tax-free cash if you don't want to. And likewise, you don't have to take a regular income. You can be quite flexible with pensions since the pension freedoms came out in 2015. But there's more of that, more on that in the other webinars that we've done as part of this series. Assuming this person has chosen to take the full tax-free cash, and then with the remaining 75% has given it to an insurance provider to pay them an annuity, which is essentially a secure income for the rest of their life, the amount they would get per year is around £8,760. Now, annuity rates change very regularly. They can fluctuate. So it's worthwhile assessing annuity rates at the time that you want to retire, but also there are other options at retirement. So you don't have to necessarily buy an annuity with most pensions. So is that enough? Well, this individual has decided they need about £26,700, which is 2/3 of their salary. The annuity alone, discounting the tax-free cash, so ignoring that for a second, would get them about 32% of the way there. We said earlier on that the state pension was around £9,100. So presuming that they check it online, make sure that what they'd be entitled to, if they would be entitled to £9,100, they're looking at being about 70% of the way there. So the benefit of the calculator here is that based on the assumptions they've popped in, they can see, well, actually, there is a bit of a gap. But the benefit is they're thinking about it now rather than getting to 65 and then realizing, right, I'm not where I want to be. And at that point, there's a little bit less room to maneuver. So worthwhile checking that out if you have a look online. And if your figures are away from where you want to be, we'll now come on to how you might look at changing that. One such way is by amending your contributions. Now, I've got an example here, and I believe that the average kind of saving on the average kind of mortgage payment in the UK is about £500 per month. If you're no longer paying that as an individual when you're retired, you might still be earning the same level of money, but actually have an additional £500 as a rough example to kind of invest or to save elsewhere. Now, I'm just with this graph here showing you the impact that can have on a pension. If you're a basic rate taxpayer, which means that you're earning less than £50,000 in total per year, and you choose to put £500 per month into a pension, you get an additional £125 on top from the government, which is the 20% tax relief being added. If you're a higher rate taxpayer, so you're earning over £50,000, then you're actually entitled to 40% tax relief, which means that you automatically receive the £125, the 20% that you did as a basic rate taxpayer. But on top of that, you can actually contact HMRC and claim back up to an additional 125 in this example. Really worthwhile doing that if you are a higher rate or additional rate top rate taxpayer. Quite a few people receive the basic rate tax relief and assume that's it. But if you're a higher or additional rate taxpayer, you can go back as far as 5 tax years to claim back additional tax relief that you're entitled to. We do have a template letter that you can send out to HMRC if you are looking at claiming back additional tax relief. So do drop us a message. We can always send that out to you. You can send us a secure message through your account or just by emailing us on the details I'll put up towards the end. If you're an additional rate top rate taxpayer, which means you're earning more than £150,000, there's actually even more tax relief that could be claimed, because in that scenario, if you're paying tax in anywhere outside of Scotland but within the UK, you're paying 45% in tax, so that can be claimed back on top. So already what you can see here is by putting in this contribution before it's even invested, you can gain additional amounts on top, so that tax relief added, which is one way of making more of what you have. Now, I'm aware that not a lot of people won't be in a position to put £500 in extra per month. That is quite a sizable amount more. Even putting in kind of £100, any figure that you can build up that pension, especially if you're making these contributions on a monthly basis. It really does add up over time. As you'd imagine, because of the generous tax reliefs associated with paying into a pension scheme, there are a few limits in place. Now, your personal contributions are usually limited to 100% of what we call your relevant UK earnings, which essentially means your salary. So if you're earning £20,000 per year, as an assumption, that's the most, including any basic rate tax relief that you receive in the pension, that you could contribute in a given tax year. Now, all of your contributions are kind of covered by a more all-encompassing allowance called the annual allowance. And this is a limit on not just what you put in, but also what the employer or your employer puts into your pension if you're employed. And if anybody else is contributing to a pension in your name, they're all limited by an allowance of up to £40,000. That £40,000 allowance will reduce for higher earners. There's something called the tapered annual allowance, which was introduced fairly recently. Do contact us if that would affect you. We've got a lot more information which we can provide if you feel like you might be subject to a lower allowance for your pension contributions. Also, if you've already accessed pensions flexibly, then you could limit your future contributions. If you take an income from a pension, either through flexible drawdown, by taking an uncrystallized fund pension lump sum, or any other flexible option, then you might be limited to just £4,000 of contributions per year. Worthwhile bearing that in mind. You can find out more at hl.co.uk/pensions/contributions. Please do make yourself familiar with these rules before making any payments into your pensions to boost that scheme. And bear in mind, tax rules do change. Our job really as the pension provider is to keep you up to date with any changes there by updating our website and providing any useful information that we can. So that's the first element that really matters, which is the contribution side of things. Next, we look at reviewing your investments. Now here, I've got an example of what kind of impact that could have. I've assumed a pot of £50,000 invested over 15 years. So if you are 50 today and you're looking at retiring at 65, we'll look at 3 different sets of growth rate here to see the impact that could have on a £50,000 pot. Now, really, the thing to look at is the kind of risk-reward payoff. Usually, if something is kind of low risk, you wouldn't expect too much of a reward for investing in that. So, for example, if you think about cash, if you have kind of cash on deposit, you think about the interest rate you're receiving now, it's probably pretty low compared to what it has been before. Those who invest in shares might be aware that there's quite a high amount of risk associated with that, because the value of shares can change drastically on a daily basis. Minute by minute, or second by second, there are kind of share prices changing. So there's a lot more volatility, and you're only going to choose to invest in shares if you believe there's a chance of a higher reward. But that's not always the case. Because of that volatility, shares can go up and down. Now, let's assume 1% growth per year on a pot of £50,000. At the end of that 15 years, it's worth about 58,000. So 1% growth is something we'd associate with a fairly conservative investment. From the outside looking in, that's not too bad at all. It's £8,000 you didn't have before, and that's not to be sniffed at. The issue is, over 15 years, you can bet that inflation is taking place, and inflation will erode the real value of the pot. Now, the target for inflation is actually 2% per year. So if you're only achieving 1% and inflation is indeed 2% per year, that £58,000 is buying you less than £50,000 was back 15 years ago. So if you're investing for the long term, you might look at taking on a bit more risk if you want to get that pot to grow, depending on your risk appetite. And that's the key thing. Your investments within your pension are personal to you. So if you have a more conservative attitude to investing, you can often change to something a bit safer. If you're more risk seeking and would like to take on more risk with a chance of a higher reward, then often you can change to weight your pension to invest more in shares and other investments that may carry a higher reward. A kind of medium or middle ground is about 4% growth per year, which might be an investment in kind of shares, bonds, cash, a whole range of different investments within a portfolio, such as a pension. Now, growth of 4% per year would mean a pension value in this scenario of about £90,000 after 15 years from 50,000. So that's quite a significant amount of growth compared to 1%. Now, something we associate with a much more adventurous approach to investing would be about 7% growth per year. And in that scenario, the pot value is closer to £137,000. So you can see here how, starting with £50,000, even making no further contributions, the significant difference that choosing the right investments can have on your pension. I would say it's worthwhile speaking to your pension provider, understand what your options are, and if there's any guidance that they can provide. If it's a workplace pension scheme, quite a lot of companies provide kind of additional help in regards to where you can invest. I'd say the key thing to take away, we've mentioned there's two factors. It's growth on your investments, but also contributions. And it's those two combined that make the biggest difference. So if we take the example that we just looked at of a £50,000 pot invested for 15 years, but in this scenario, the person is making a £500 gross contribution. So that's inclusive of any tax relief that they're receiving. 1% growth and the £500 contribution actually gets them to 155,000. At 4%, it'd be about 212, and at 7% growth, it'd be closer to 300,000 as a pension pot. So you can see here that within 15 years, that pot size has increased significantly. As we've said, unfortunately, it's not as easy as choosing 7% growth if that was an option. I think the choice will be pretty simple, but unfortunately, if you are looking at your investments, if something carries a potential high kind of payoff, you can bet the risks are probably pretty high as well. So it's worth thinking about what will be right for you. So I'd say after this webinar, 3 key things to take away, 3 key decisions is one is, are you contributing enough? We've used the example of £500 to keep things nice and round, but the reality is, even if you're putting in £100 per month, maybe even less than that, over 15, 20, 30 years, that can make a very significant difference to your pension pot. Where are you currently investing? It's worth thinking about how long you have to retirement, your individual risk appetite as well, because those are the things that are going to dictate where you might invest. If you've got a long time to retirement, you might have the capacity to take on more risk. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do that. And finally, can you simplify things? This is something that we've not touched on as of yet, but it's worth talking about briefly. It's actually anticipated that by 2050, there'll be around 50 million lost or dormant pension schemes in the UK. It's a huge figure. It's a scary figure to look at. And the issue is that a lot of people might have worked at previous employers or had personal pensions that they've forgotten about over time. If you change address, your home address, you forget to update your pension provider. When you get to retirement, you may have forgotten about kind of where those pensions were held, which means that you might not be able to access all of the pensions that you've paid into and kind of managed over time. There is a pensions tracing service, which is available through the government website. There are companies that will charge to track down your pension, but there is a free service through the government pensions tracing service. The idea is you pop in your details, and that will tell you where your older pensions might have been. So worthwhile checking that out just to get an understanding of what you have currently. If you get an idea about where your pensions are held, worthwhile updating your details with those pension providers. And then there's a few decisions that you can make, but as long as they've got your details, you know that at retirement you've grasped where all your pensions are. That's a really important step before you reach retirement to ensure that you're getting what you're entitled to. One decision that you can make is you may benefit from consolidation. So if you have 5, 6, 7 different pension schemes, bringing them into one or even 2, 3 schemes can help your kind of management around that. The major benefit being that reduced administration. Now, before doing that, I would say it's best to check for any excessive transfer fees, or if there will be any guarantees attached to your pensions that will be lost on transfer. Now, usually the process would be that your pensions are transferred as cash, which means the investments that you have are sold, the cash is transferred to the new provider, and then reinvested in any kind of investments that you choose at that point. So there is a period of time where you'll be out of the market. Now that can work for or against you, because if you sell the investments and transfer it, and in that time the market kind of increases, if you're planning on investing in the same place, you're buying back those investments at a much higher price. Whereas if the market was to drop in value in that time, you might buy them back at a cheaper price and benefit. So there is a bit of risk there, but it's worth being aware of that. If you do speak to your pension providers and you're unsure whether you should or shouldn't transfer, you may need to seek financial advice, where an advisor could actually kind of find out the ins and outs of your pensions and then tell you whether it's in your interest to transfer or not. Before we wrap up the webinar and provide you with a few useful ways of contacting us, I've got a statistic here which isn't really designed to scare you, but it does tend to have that effect. There's actually 180 pay days left for someone turning 50 today and retiring at 65. And it's quite common for us when we're assisting people to hear that people at age 50 think, well, actually, it might be a bit too late for me to make a difference. That's simply not the case. If you look at your contributions and you look at your investments, seek any assistance that you can. It's very possible to make a difference. So if you do have any questions, there is the retirement help desk who are available to discuss your options at retirement and so on. The best telephone number to reach them is 0117 980 9940. If you would prefer to send an email, it's retire@hl.co.uk, and it's important to us that when you give us a call, you're not waiting too long. The average pickup time, I think last year was about 20 seconds. The average response time for an email is about 1 to 2 days, so you're never waiting too long to get an answer to your questions. I'd stress that it's information as opposed to advice, just as this webinar has been. But if you're looking for another voice to hear any information from and another source to get those details, there is PensionWise, which is a free and impartial guidance service, which was introduced in 2015 when we had the pension freedoms come into play, where now it's your pensions are a lot more accessible than they have been previously. It's for anyone aged 50 or over with a workplace or personal pension, and for anybody looking for help to understand the different options available. They're available online at pensionwise.gov.uk or over the phone at 0800 138 3944. So thank you for listening today. Before you do kind of end this webinar, do take a few minutes to read through our important investment notes. There's a few useful details in here, and of course it's explaining that it's information as opposed to financial advice, but do take a few minutes to read through this. Okay, so thank you for listening today. I hope that provided some useful information for you and a bit of food for thought there. If you do have any questions at all or want any more information, do send us an email or give us a call, and we'd be more than happy to help with that. I hope you have a great day, and thank you for listening.